Hey everyone, welcome to Clean Mechanics and Clear Communication. My name is Namita DigheShetty. I am a certified dog trainer and behavior consultant. We'll talk a little bit more about my background at the end of the webinar. Let's just get straight into it for now. So why exactly do we need this webinar? Well, we're talking about humans and dogs that are completely different species. They communicate differently, they use their brains differently. So it's important to understand that the way we communicate with each other is not the same way a dog communicates to us or to other dogs. If we're going to think about how humans communicate, the main form of communication is language, using words. And sometimes there is a use of tone and there's body language, but we predominantly rely on words to communicate what we want to say to each other, as well as to animals too. But when it comes to dogs, their entire form of communication can rely solely on body language, whether it is their tail or their eyes or their movement of their body. They can have full conversations without even ever saying a word. Yes, they can escalate to barking and vocalization and growling, and at worst case scenarios, biting, but that's not what their first form of communication is. Even if you talk about the two brains, our brain is far more developed and we're able to think of complex things like good, bad, intentional, unintentional, morals, and ethics, but our dogs' brains are pretty simplified. All their focus is on is how to meet their need. And that need could be anything in that particular moment. They are only thinking about how to access and gain that need in that moment. They're not able to think of complex things because cognitively, their brain is no more than a 2-year-old human. And it's going to stay that way pretty much their entire life. So when we think of it from that perspective, the onus relies in us as humans to understand animals if we're going to coexist with them. We can't expect to communicate with them without conflict if we're not able to understand them better. And when we tend to go the way that we've been going for the past 50 decades of the past 5 decades or so about how we've been communicating with dogs, we'll realize that there's a lot of confusion and conflict and frustration because of things like dominance theory and alpha theory and all sorts of things that indicate that we have to be above and superior to our dogs, which is completely untrue. So let's get to what is it that dogs need in order to learn something. How do they learn anything? Well, primarily it's through associations. There are things that they experience on a day-to-day basis that gives them a feeling of good or pleasant feelings. And there are things that make them feel unpleasant. I want to stick to pleasant and unpleasant versus good and bad, because good and bad are human constructs at the end of the day. But when I'm thinking of pleasant things, I know we think of things like food and love and things like that, but we also have to think about freedom, choice, consent, and safety, because these are things that look different to us and look different to dogs. So if we're not thinking from that perspective, we don't understand what dogs are seeking when we're thinking of pleasant feelings. And the same thing with unpleasant feelings. We are very familiar with anxiousness and stress and scared and danger and things like that. But we also have to think about confusion, unpredictability, frustration, discomfort, and a very, very forgotten form is pain. So pain in their body, pain because of their overall health being poor, can also affect how they associate something happening in that moment. So essentially, it is all about something that makes them feel good. Yes, this is awesome. I want more of it. This is what I want to do. Or something that makes them feel not so good, which is, yikes, I just want to stay the heck away from this thing. It didn't feel good. And things that they like to do and they feel good about, they are more likely to repeat it. And things that they don't like, they are less likely to repeat it. And this is where humans can add in and help them improve behaviors or reduce behaviors by providing reinforcement or punishments. Then there are also patterns that dogs can learn, that when I do this, then this happens. But we're not going to get into operant conditioning and classical conditioning today. I just want to to understand how dogs learn so that we have some sort of a baseline when we're thinking about whatever we're going to discuss today. So what is a cue? It brings me, the question about patterns brings me to cues. Cues are pretty much the form of pattern. It's a hint or a signal to your dog about what's going to happen next. It's a prediction that something is going to happen because they are always correlated. It doesn't always have to be verbal, and it basically tells your dog what to expect in that situation. And we most commonly use the word command in popular culture, but I don't like to use that word because it takes us at a mindset which is pretty old school, if you ask, because when you're commanding somebody to do something, it seems very demanding. And when it's demanding, it doesn't come from a place of empathy and understanding the animal that you're working with. So I stick to the word cue. It's pretty much the same thing, but it has a different intention because I'm able to understand that they're not just the words that I've taught my dog. They are everything in the environment that indicates something else is about to happen. So there are visual cues, there are verbal cues, and environmental cue. A visual cue would be something like you pick up the leash and your dog knows exactly what you're going to do next. You're going to go for a walk and they're most likely excited. A verbal cue is all our usual down, sit, fetch, those kind of cues. And an environmental cue is more likely to be something like you only go to this specific location for a specific event, like the dog park or the vet or the daycare, that sort of indicates to the dog what's going to happen next. I want you to take a look at this video here and notice how my dog responds. So there's not much information on this video, and I really wish I was able to catch the audio much clearer, but my husband just opens the closet and wears his pants. And that's enough for my dog to just stop doing whatever he's doing and come to the room and check what's happening. It's an indication to him that we're about to go out, whether it's with him or not. Whenever we open the closet, that sound of us opening the closet is enough to predict that somebody's leaving the house or getting dressed. So we have to remember that cues are forming whether or not we are intentionally teaching our dogs. They are forming all the time. And that's really important because when we're trying to get our dogs to do something, we may not realize that we have created a chain of cues that tell them a different message than what we are trying to communicate with them. And that could be a reason why they're not acting the way we would expect them to in that particular situation. That also brings me to body language. When it comes to humans, if you notice the person in this video, they are moving their hands, their head, and speaking all at the same time. Now, when we spoke a little bit earlier about how dogs communicate and how humans communicate, if you notice, I talked about how dogs are focused on body language because that's how they communicate with each other. So when we as humans are talking and moving at the same time, that makes it really difficult for our dogs to listen to what we're saying. If you were to be sitting, standing, bending over when you're teaching a specific skill, and then now you suddenly change that image, it does affect how your dog remembers that image. At the same time, if your hands are in your treat pouch, your dog is thinking about how to get that food right now and not really listening to your verbal cues. So it's important to understand that when you are speaking with your dog and moving at the same time, things get really confusing and complicated there. And we'll get a little bit more on how to make sure that doesn't happen a little bit later in the webinar. Okay, this thing needed to wait before it started. So I want you to listen to this and look at this video. It's a funny reel that I made, but it also shows what I mean when I say our hands can do too much talking and can confuse the dog. So I don't know if you were able to catch the entire video, but What you notice is that when my husband is trying to get my dog to roll over, he has very big movements with his hands. They're going all over the place, and there is very little information for my dog to understand what's happening. But when it came to me, I choose to first get him into a down, and then I move my hand in a specific order closer to his body, and then roll him over, and then reward him. So such a subtle difference in our body language and how we communicated this to our dog made a huge difference. And it's something we don't really think about when we are asking our dogs to do behaviors that we think they already know and understand. But how we trained them these behaviors while we were training them versus how we actually applied them in real life can make a huge difference. And that can often lead to that confusion. And it's important for us to know that that plays a role, because then we can adapt accordingly when we're expecting something from our dogs. This brings me to the training loop. So the training loop is a simple system of making sure that you are following the steps as clean and clearly as you can, so that the communication between your dog and you is pretty clear. So what that consists of, you start with a cue, either a verbal or visual cue, and then you follow it up with a mark, which is something we're going to talk about in a bit. And then you reward your dog for performing that behavior correctly, and then release the dog, which is what I call a reset. So let's look at these things individually and then look at how they work together at the end. When it comes to markers, I'm sure many of you must have heard of them. They can be a click or yes, or some people use chirp, or some people can use good. You can use any word. It's just a sound that stays consistent, and it helps you mark the specific time that your dog performed the behavior. So for instance, in this video, the dog goes from a stand to a down, and it's pretty obvious that right when his body goes into a down, you would mark, and then you would reward them. Some people do not use markers, and the only issue that I see with that is that when you're teaching a new behavior, if you look at this screenshot, these screen grabs of the same video, you can see how many different positions the dog is in between a stand to a down. Now, if you think about it from the dog's perspective, the dog has changed its body movements to a great extent to get to that position you want them to. The original video is only 5 seconds. So you can imagine from the dog's perspective, if they were still learning this behavior, they would not know at what point did this particular action take place, because oftentimes us as humans, we're more likely to say good at the point of 7 or 6 even, and we won't realize that we're already bringing out our treat and rewarding our dog in that moment. And that's where the confusion happens. So marking is useful to specifically tell your dog, what was that exact moment that you performed the behavior I wanted? And if your dog is still learning a behavior, then you're able to mark progressions. So for that, in this particular video, that progression could look anywhere between 1 to 9, depending on how new the skill is to the dog. So you can see how if I encouraged number 1, my dog is going to want to do that behavior again. And each time I can progress to probably number 4, and eventually 7, and finally get to 9. So it also helps you tell your dog when they're going in the right direction that that's where I want you to go. And it helps you pinpoint that in that precise moment because you're using a marker. And also when you're luring dogs, so in this particular video, I was not luring a dog, but if you were luring a dog with food, at what point in that process will your dog understand that that's the behavior you're looking for? Because they can still smell and kind of lick at the treat that you are holding the whole time between going in a stand to a down. So that's another reason why using a marker can really be useful in your training. Another reason is you simply have about a second point to make an association between what your dog did and delivering the treat. So if your hands are in your pockets already, that's because you know that before you can even give them that treat, they stand up and they're off. So you want to make sure that you're ready with your treats, but you don't have to, because if you're going to be doing that, then your dog's only focused on your treats and not so much on what you're asking from them. And also they're not really learning in that moment, and it makes the learning process a little more confusing. So it's acting as a bridge between your behavior that the dog does and the moment that you're able to deliver that food to them. Some things to remember is that you always want to make sure you feed after you've used a marker. So if you accidentally end up saying yes when your dog didn't do anything, or you had no intention of giving them a treat, just go ahead and give it to them. It's not going to do any harm. And if you do end up saying it and not giving them a treat, it's not the end of the world. But I want you to build value. So just like this jar that's full of hearts, I want you to build value for that marker word to a point that a dog understands that there's 100% guarantee I am going to get a treat if I hear this word. And that's the value that you'll be building for the marker, which will help you shape behaviors too. Like we were talking about earlier, it helps you get to a point from point A to B much quicker because you're able to give information to your dog as they're progressing in their behavior. If you really, really want to get fancy, you can also use location-specific markers. Now, these are absolutely unnecessary. Let me just say that out there. But these are ways to give your dog information about where that reinforcement is going to come from, or what is it going to come from, or what the reinforcement is. So we most commonly use yes. In my case, yes means I will bring the food to you. You could use dish for putting the food in the dish every time you're done with the trick. I'm going to show you how to do that. You can use find it, which would mean sniffing the ground for food. You can say take it, which means the dog comes to you to take it. Get it is another one that we use for toys, to release the dog to go grab the toy. And all done is another one that basically tells the dog the task is over, and that's the last cookie they're getting in that task. So whether you're using a location marker or whether you're using a regular marker throughout your training process, the way to introduce a marker is pretty much the same thing. You start by pairing the word with the reinforcement without having any expectations from the dog, and then you start applying it in your day-to-day training and behaviors. So here's the example. Dish. 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 Just for reference, this is the first time my dog is trying this. We haven't worked on this before. Dish. So just at that moment when he looks into the bowl when I say dish after sitting, that tells me he understands that the reinforcement is going to be inside the bowl. You will know your dog has started to make the connection when you start noticing a very specific interest towards that word, whether or not there's any context involved in it. So if you were to say yes around my dog, he's probably going to look at you even if nothing's happening. So that's when you know your marker has some value to your dog, and you want to maintain that value, which is why you don't use it unless you intend to pay with a reward. Another very interesting aspect of the training loop that isn't talked enough about is a reset cookie or a release cue. The reason why I like to use that as a part of my process is because it allows me to assess whether or not the dog is continuing to participate in this interaction. Is it something that they really still want to be a part of, or have they checked out and they want to be done? So when you notice, I will show you the video again in a second, but another thing that it can help you with is that when the dog is doing the behavior, it gives them a chance to reset instead of being stuck there, especially in complicated behaviors where the dog is confused. It gives a dog the reset, to start over and try again. And at the same time, it gives you the same thing. It gives you a reset. So I want you to go back here and notice how I do toss a cookie away to get him away from the bowl because he's just stuck in there. So that's a reset cookie. I use any word. So for me, that is break. I say break and I toss a cookie away from where we are. So that is a release word for my dog. Release words are really good for behaviors where you want the dog to be stationed at a particular position, like a sit stay or a down stay, because then it tells your dog, when is it that I'm allowed to get up from this position? You'll notice that a lot of dogs, they can do the down stay and they can be around you, but the moment you step a step away, staying in position is harder for them because we haven't worked on the idea of you wait for the release cue before you leave. And when this becomes a part of our routine, it kind of becomes very easy to transition into stationary positions. So the sequence is pretty simple. If you are using a verbal cue only and you're at a point where your dog already knows this behavior, it's pretty clear and evident to them, you want to start with neutral hands and say the verbal cue. So you're going to say something like sit, then you're going to show them the hand signal. And as soon as they sit, you mark, and then you reach into your pocket for a treat and deliver the treat. Let's look at it. So as you noticed before, I was at the beginning of the video, I was practicing without my dog, even though he was on the side there. But the reason I was practicing without my dog is often we don't understand how this is actually very difficult for us to remember all these steps. How do I make sure that my hands are not in my pocket already? How do I make sure that I haven't, I don't have the treats in my hand? When do I say yes? When do I actually cue the dog? These are very difficult things to do when it's not something that you're used to on an everyday basis. So oftentimes when I do group classes, I make sure that this is part of the exercise. To use this moment to learn how to do it without the dog in the picture, and then add your dog into the picture. So it's a bit of an exercise here that I'm sure you can screenshot it if you look at the video later on when it's up on YouTube. But essentially, what I would recommend doing is practicing with your neutral body, with your hands on the side, saying the cue, or start with just yes. Say yes, grab the treat, feed it to an imaginary dog. And then you can do this with a bowl on the table, with a treat pouch, with a hoodie, with a standing, sitting, all sorts of different situations where you would be reinforcing your dog for behaviors. And also then start adding cues to it. So you say sit, then you show your hand signal, then you pause to imagine the dog's going to do it, mark and deliver. Don't underestimate the value of learning this process and how much clarity it can get you when you're working with your dog. Because we're two different individuals, like I said, and we're both trying to communicate in a way that's different for both of us. So it's important that if you want to improve that communication between you and your dog, that you can work on this little bit of piece of information that can bring so much more clarity, because you're not mixing everything together. As humans, we do everything together. I mean, I am moving my hands and my head and talking everything at the same time, and that could be too much for our dogs. So this little exercise can make a huge difference in how you start remembering to say yes, then grab your cookie and then give it to them, especially if you don't particularly only use a treat pouch and sometimes you wear a pocket put your treats in your pocket, or especially if you want to do the same thing with treats at home on a desk and things like that. All right, so let's talk about generalization, which I'm sure that you've probably heard of, but I just want everybody to be on the same page. So I just want you to look at this picture, and when you look at it, can you spot the differences among the humans? Let's ignore the bottom line, but even if you think about just the humans, is it easy to tell what is the real difference between them? Right? Something might be obvious. Some of it might be obvious, but some of it might actually not be that so obvious. What I want you to understand is, from the dog's perspective, these are 4 different pictures. A person who's sitting down on the ground, a person whose hands are right in front of their belly, one's with a hand on a hip. Those are different images. And because their brains are so simplified, it's not that easy for them to identify that this is the same thing. This is just the same person who's standing and sitting and all of those things and same behaviors, because the picture has changed completely. And the same thing applies to environments. Your home and the couch is familiar. It looks the same every single time. But when we go outside and what traffic looks like, it's completely different. There's so much happening around us. And we go to the park and there's so many beautiful smells and so much is different. So when we're talking about a simplified brain like that of a dog, we are confusing the picture in that moment. And that's fine. I mean, that's realistic. We have to live in this world that is diverse and different. But we also want to understand that that means things are a little harder for our dog when we change the picture. So when the picture changes, it gets complex and confusing. And one way you can help your dog is if you practice these scenarios or these behaviors in different situations, positions, and distractions. So positions could mean something as simple as sitting, standing, or having your dog on the side instead of the front, because as we know, most of our actions with our dogs are face to face. But when we're walking on the street, for instance, our dog is on the side. So does our dog know the same behavior that they see face to face as being on the side? Not really. It's a whole different image if you think about it from the dog's perspective. And that's why it's important to think about that when you're teaching a certain behavior. So for example, when it comes to sit, I'm just taking sit because it's the most common thing that everybody teaches their dog. It is really not a very useful skill. But if you were supposed to think about sit, and I taught my dog sit with me standing in front of him and doing this action or whatever it is, and now my dog's on my side walking by with me, and then I have to cross the street, it's the end of the pavement, and I want him to sit. Now I'm asking him to sit like this, but he's next to it. So the image changes completely. Have I trained my dog enough to actually understand that? Or do I just expect that he's going to figure it out? Because me as a human being can learn a skill in my home on the computer and apply it everywhere else in the world. But that's not how dogs work. That's not how their brain functions. And so it's important for us to remember that if we're expecting something from them in a different scenario, then we want to prepare them for that. We want to make sure that we've actually taken the time to rehearse these things, especially if they mean something to us. If they're important to us, then we must take the time to rehearse them in those particular scenarios. So one of the most difficult things to figure out is, how do you fade out treats or lures when you are teaching behaviors to your dogs? Now, this entirely depends on what stage you are at when you're teaching your dogs and how quickly a dog learns. Sorry, I often call dogs persons, but that's okay. So it depends on what stage and how quickly a dog is able to pick up a skill, whether or not you want to fade a prompt or a lure. Prompts are really helpful to teach dogs what exactly it is that you want them to do. So do not rush yourself into eliminating them. because, I don't know, it looks fancier that you can tell your dog what to do and they do it. It really isn't that important for them to be able to do it on their own without any help whatsoever. So let's not be married to that situation where, like, I don't want to have to help him. I don't want him or her to be needing me to move them and lure them into position. Think more about, what is this environment? Is this too much for my dog? Can I help him if I use a lure? Can I use my hand to make him get into position? Can I use a cookie to get him into position? It is okay to reintroduce prompts when the environment is challenging. And when you're starting to fade prompts, always remember to start the session with the last known prompt that your dog knows. So let's just look at the example here. Yes. Test whether or not they're ready. Yes. Test whether or not they're ready to do it. So, yes. Very good job. Very good, oh boy. Nice work. So I know that this video can seem very confusing because you really can't tell what's exactly happening every single second that it happens. And I'm sorry I don't have a better video to explain this, but I tried to use a behavior that my dog doesn't already know in order to make sure that it looks more authentic. So what I am doing is I am starting to test over right here. I'm trying to test whether or not he can do it without food. And it kind of succeeds, but also fails. And then once again, here you can see there's hesitation that tells me I'm doing this too quickly. So the next time I try to use a food lure again, because I don't want to set my dog up to feel frustrated. So it's okay for me to go one step back because I don't want my dog to feel like he did something wrong. Yes, very good. And right here, I took a little longer to say yes, just to get my dog to understand that staying in position and not actually looping my fingers is what I was expecting from him. So you can also use your markers to delay a certain or increase the duration of time a dog does a behavior by saying yes a little bit later. But you want to grow really gradually towards that. Very good. I'm also jackpotting him for this position because I noticed a lot of times he would go around my leg and come to the front instead of actually staying there. So this tells him staying in position, in that specific position, is really good for him. And that's why he continues to hang out there. And really quickly, I'm able to reduce the amount of times I have to use my specific hand movement to get him all around me. So essentially, I want you to just to sort of summarize what you just saw in this really complicated video is continue to use food until you see fluid movement from your dog. As soon as you start noticing there's a fluid movement with your lures and your prompts, you can then maybe test and see what happens when I don't use a food lure. But if that's the beginning of your session, always start with the food lure if you've been using one, then move on to try and test whether or not it will work without one, and then randomize between using one and not using one until you slowly start to not use food in that luring process. And once you've gotten the behavior fluidly without using food, you can start reducing the hand movements that you are using in order to prompt your dog. As always, if the situation is challenging for your dog, there's no reason why you shouldn't be helping them or prompting them, whether it's using a food lure or whether you're using a hand lures. It doesn't matter unless you're in competition. But if you're a regular dog mom or dog dad who's just trying to have a good time with your dog, don't get caught up in the specificities of, I don't want to be able to help. Like, they know this behavior. That is a very human way of thinking. It's not even helpful to humans, honestly. Help is always a good thing when people are struggling. All right. So when do we use, how to add a verbal cue is what everybody wants to know. But before that, it's important to understand, when do we use a verbal cue? When is it okay for me to start saying the word when I'm teaching the dog? So remember at the beginning, we said dogs will always focus on our body language instead of our hand movements, and our hand movements instead of our words. So often I've noticed that parents that come to classes will be starting their words right before when they're luring their dogs into positions. So even if they're teaching a down, which is literally the dog going from a standing position to a down position, or from a sit to a down, they're saying down to them the whole time that their hands are moving from up to down, up to down. And not only that, you will notice a tone in their down. So it will go down, down. And we're wasting our energy and we're ruining the word down to our dogs because all it becomes is white noise. So you want to ask yourself a few questions before you actually think about, is it time to introduce a verbal cue? Now, when it comes to things like drop it, we do have errorless ways of using drop it in a different context and introducing it before we even taught what it is to drop it. But that aside, let's talk about generally when we're training for specific behaviors like a sit, down, walk with me or something like that. When is it that we start introducing the word? We want to ask ourselves, does the dog truly understand the behavior? And when I say understand the behavior, I mean, do you see that fluidity? Do you see that every time you are using your lure, your dog's like, I know what we're doing. I know exactly what you want me to do. That's how you can decide whether or not it's time. You want to be able to see how frequently they're able to perform the behavior with fluidity. And the next question you want to ask yourself is, are you still using food lures, or have you started transitioning to just your hands? And the reason why this is important is there's a lot of dogs that are so excited by the food that paying attention to your food, your hand movement, and your words is going to be so hard on them. So before you can move on to adding a verbal cue, I recommend fading out your food lure and then adding your verbal cue, because then there's less things for the dog to be worried about. And lastly, this is an optional thing. I don't think it's necessary, but if you've started to fade out your lure, that's even better. But if you haven't, I still think it's okay to introduce a verbal cue. But depending on the situation, I tend to wait until I've been able to also fade out a little bit of my hand movement before I introduce a verbal cue into the situation. So how do you add a verbal cue? So we have to think about it as the verbal cue is the new cue, right? Because so far we've been teaching our dogs to use our hands and lure them into a position, and we teach them a different hand signal, whatever it is that we're doing. So we are already using a cue. Now we need to add a sound cue to that. So we want to think of that as a new cue, which will always be before everything else in this sort of sequence of things when you're training. And this is also very useful for changing any poisoned cues. So for instance, I think come becomes a very poisoned cue because people often tend to repeat it so often that their dogs are completely tone deaf towards it and they no longer respond to it. So then you want to try and introduce a new word for it. So then this is what you'd be doing. You'd be using the new word, then the old word, then mark and reward. But let's get back to how you add a verbal cue. So you use a new cue, which is the word. Then you say, show the old cue, your hand signal, you mark, and you reward. It's important to remember that you say the word before you move your body or your hand gesture. Remind him of this behavior because we have done it. Yeah, remind him. My videos are really shabby today, but sorry about that. So before we look into the video, let's just go through the steps. You wait until your dog is fluid with no food lures. You start with a couple reps of reminders. So in this video, you're going to notice me reminding him with a food lure first, because it's we don't even do this behavior most of the times. And then we do another handler, and then I try to introduce the word, which he kind of knows. But the point is, I want you to see how I introduce the word. And you say the word without moving your hands. You keep your hands in a neutral position. Then you can show them the physical lure, and then you can mark and reward. Remind him of this behavior because we have done it, yes, but we don't have enough practice. Yes, some practice doing this behavior. Yes, good boy. Finish. So let's watch the part where I introduce the verbal cue again. Notice how my hands are on my side and I say the cue before my hands start moving. Finish. Yes, good job. Even though my dog is probably going to be able to learn if I was to say it with movement, it just makes it easier for him if he has to focus on one less thing in that moment. And that's what this is about. It's not so much that you cannot do it any other way, but it's about, can you make it a little bit easier on your dog? And can that make the communication between you and your dog a bit better, right? That's what we want. All right, and after you've done this with several repetitions, you can slowly start to fade out your hand movements. And then you'll be simply saying the cue and your dog will probably know what you're expecting. But it takes a lot longer, I think, for most dogs to fade out the hand signal even after the verbal cue has been introduced. And I feel like a lot of people are very quick to fade out that hand signal. And some people don't realize that they're still doing it. So when they're doing it, the dog's able to do the behavior, but when they're not doing it and they're just simply saying the cue, they wonder why the dog does not know what's happening, because it's been so clearly pictured in the dog's mind that there is no picture without that hand signal. So the hand signal is so much a part of the picture that without it, it really is not the same, which makes it really hard for them to understand what's happening. And I really don't think there's anything wrong with dogs not needing hand signals, but if you're wondering why my dog cannot do it sometimes, but can do it sometimes, that could be the reason, because they don't understand the picture without the hand movements, and they've had no practice in understanding how to start ignoring it as it fades away. So some other things to remember are that repeating cues over and over again drains out our voice and kind of makes it like white noise. Basically, it just sounds like the TV or the radio or the raindrops, and the dogs are no longer listening to what we're saying. So there's no point of going over and over again, saying the same thing. Sometimes I even hear guardians doing yes, 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 over and over again, instead of just saying yes. And then, they can show the dog the food. They're so caught up with the fact that the dog has not responded to their yes that they need to repeat it. But they don't understand that verbal communication is not a priority to the dog. So that you're wasting your energy and you're also ruining your particular cue. So if you do need to repeat a cue, I always recommend waiting about 4 or 5 seconds. And why? Because your dog is an actual living being. Give them some time to process what they've just heard. Sometimes there's so much else happening around them that even though they've heard what you said, there may be so much happening other than like, there might be so many things like, am I comfortable right now? This ground doesn't feel that good. I heard something really scary over there. There's so much happening. Give your dog a little bit of time to process what you've said. And if you still feel the need to repeat a cue, you can always do that about 4 or 5 seconds after you've repeated the first one. I always find that visually prompting your dog right after is far more useful than like repeating the cue over and over again. It's just going to frustrate you and your tone is going to start sounding really unpleasant, and then your dog starts to predict to only really listen when things get really serious and unpleasant. How to add distractions. So we all want to know how to add distractions because essentially this whole world is a distraction to our dog. And there are so many of them that it's almost impossible to avoid them, right? So the thing about distractions is you want to gradually increase distractions at the dog's pace, but you're also like, we live in the real world. We can't be sitting in the dark caves, just protecting our dogs from everything that's happening. But this information is not so much about what you can do to the dog, but so much more about what you can expect from the dog in a given scenario. So it's not like you can't expect to take your dog to these distracted places. It's what do you expect from them in those places? And that depends on how much work have you put in to gradually increase their exposure to this particular skill. So just like we were talking about luring and fading out lures, distractions are also part of that. You cannot expect a dog that has learned something in a quiet room with no distractions to now be able to just do that in the world outside, because dogs don't generalize like humans do. So providing your dog with help in the form of prompts when you've increased the distractions is really helpful. Don't shy away from that, or don't be discouraged if you have to help them. And when you notice that there's an ease in behaviors in a set particular number of distractions, then you can consider increasing the distraction and seeing if they're able to succeed in a more distracting environment. It's all about managing your expectations compared to the reality of what your dog has experienced, right? And it's also okay to have regressions. It's not going to be the same no matter what happens. And like, oh, my dog is perfect in everything now. He's never going to not want to be able to do the cues if he's in like a busy area. That's not true, because your dog is a living being and perfection is just an illusion. So when you're thinking about gradually increasing distractions, one way I like to think about it is like start in a quiet room where there's only you and your dog and no other distractions. Then maybe you can go on to another room where a human, it's not another room, but a room where another human being is there, or the TV is on, or something else is there to add some distraction, but not too much. Then you could probably try in your backyard, which is still an outdoor environment. It's still busy, but not visually that busy, hopefully, because you have a fence or something like that. You can then move on to a parking lot, which is not your home, so it's not as familiar, but it's still outside, or an empty park if you're lucky, or a back alley, unless scents are an issue. So if the dog is very scent driven, that might be too much for them. But depending on what the situation is for your dog, you can adapt accordingly. And then I would increase it to a park with maybe 1 or 2 distractions, but I would still be quite far away from those distractions. The next step would be more distractions, but still far away from the distractions, because distance is as important as slowly increasing distractions. So it's not just about exposure, but also how far the exposure is from the animal. That can be very different for each dog. And then eventually going closer to distractions. But all of this should happen at the pace that the dog is comfortable at. So it doesn't matter what our personal opinion is about how long this should take, but more so about what the dog is ready for, right? Okay, so the value of approximations. We have talked a little bit about this, but I want to touch base on it again, because I cannot emphasize enough about how learning does not happen without motivation. When you have to learn something new, you need to be motivated to do that. If you're not feeling confident, if you're not feeling empowered, you're not going to want to learn. And the same thing applies to animals too. So it's important to understand that instead of focusing on, did my dog do the right behavior or the wrong behavior, focus on what was it that my dog did that was really good. Can I mark and reinforce that? Can I encourage the movement towards my final movement more so than I can punish or ignore the movements that did not go according to my ways? So I don't know if you remember earlier when I said I didn't really like what he did there, but I did toss a treat away because there's no point in me punishing my dog by not giving him a treat. That's not going to do anything. That's if anything, that demoralizes him, makes him think, oh, this is not a fun game anymore. Like I don't want to participate. Why should I participate in it? So it's important to understand that motivation fuels learning, and that you need to think of ways to reward and mark and reward approximate movements towards what is it that you're finally looking for. And even when it comes to behavioral things, like, can I be happy that my dog is able to react maybe with one bark instead of 7 barks constantly towards their trigger? Or can I be okay that it went from 7 to 3? You know, we have to break them down further and further until we get to a point where the dog is motivated to push more than that. Because if we just look at good and bad, right and wrong, then we're killing that little bit of excitement that the dog can offer, the little bit of enthusiasm and participation that the dog is willing to offer. And that brings me to frustration, because frustration isn't fun for anyone. It often comes from confusion and often is seen in behaviors where you're asking your dog to stay, but you're asking for too long and the dog has no understanding of when it is going to be released, because often people don't have release cues for their dogs, or you're really just being unrealistic and asking for a sustained amount of time for your dog to stay. And so you start noticing them barking at you or pawing at you or things like that. Or if you're asking for multiple cues and not really giving any reinforcement to your dog, so you'll notice them barking at you. You can also notice frustration in training when your dog tends to throw in a bunch of different behaviors that don't look anything like the behavior you're asking for. And that could also be a sign of fatigue, like just being tired from the session. It's important to keep sessions shorter so that your dog feels like is actively participating and is not mentally fatigued. And also frustration comes from ignoring a request. So a lot of old school dog training was about ignoring behaviors you don't like. And what that does is, yes, it extinguishes the behavior over a period of time, but it also happens at the cost of frustration, because the dog is, we have to remember that everything a dog is doing is coming from a specific need. Some motivation is driving that behavior. Every behavior has a function. It's not just this mindless thing that's happening. And it's quite similar for humans as well. We don't just behave the way we want, just randomly. There's a motivation behind our behavior. So when we're ignoring a dog, all we're teaching them is there's no way to get what I need in that moment. Not want, need. It's important to understand it's a need. Whether we think it's reasonable or not doesn't matter, but it's a need that the dog has, whether it's for your attention, whether it's for food, whether it's to go out on a walk. Ignoring those requests doesn't teach them how to ask for a request nicely, doesn't teach them better ways to gain access to that request. It simply frustrates them because they realize that no matter what they're going to do, they're not going to get what they want. And while in some situations that may feel like, oh, sorry, this is what it is, I can't give them everything, could feel like that. But if you can minimize ignoring your dog's requests, it is a healthier relationship for you as well as your dog. Because I don't think you would want to be ignored if you wanted something and you were requesting for it, right? And then it also creates a negative association between us and the dog. Working with us is not fun anymore. Interacting and training with us is not fun anymore because things always go the way that the person wants and not what the dog wants. So that's something to remember too. And doing your best in making sure your dog is still having fun while training is really important. So a reset cookie is a nice way to know whether or not your dog is still participating. If you notice your dog coming back into the activity, that means the dog is actually participating in the activity. If you notice the dog actually just goes around and sniffs something else, you know that that dog has checked out. Another way is just to make sure that you're not asking for something your dog isn't prepared to do. If your dog is not prepared to do a 10-minute stay, don't ask for it. And is it even a realistic ask? Think about that, right? All right, so something else that I like to use in my day-to-day life with my dog, and I don't know if that's something that's specifically a different thing at all, but I do like to create a little bit of sense of predictability for tasks in my dog's life. So for instance, I do that with carrying him. Okay, I don't have to carry him often. Look at him, he's huge. But if we were to go on a hike and he was injured and I needed to carry him, or if for a medical reason I needed to carry him, I don't want him to feel surprised, agitated, and flail himself when I'm doing that. So I created a pattern of I say this cue and I stand in a certain way, and then I wait for my dog to show he's ready for it, and then I carry him. So he knows that when I say that to you, this is what's going to happen. This is what is expected. Now, a start cue like that doesn't automatically make it a pleasant thing to happen. That's something that's a whole different aspect, working on making it a positive interaction. But it also helps if your dog can know this is going to happen and then be prepared for it, rather than you just suddenly grabbing them and then them creating a negative feeling towards you, because when you come to me, all these unpleasant things happen and they happen randomly. So whether it's for carrying or grabbing them quickly by their collar, that's something I like to practice. So I will say grab, and then I'll grab and I'll mark and feed, and I will work on that behavior for a while. Or suddenly turning, so teaching a U-turn. And then other things like ending play. So all done is my cue for ending a play, ending a training session. And even for sniffing, I say, let's go. And then I give my dog a few seconds to sniff, because then my dog knows that I intend to move after that. So my dog has some expectation of like, oh, we are going to move, but it's not like I'm going to yank him out of there and leave. However, it becomes a routine that when I say let's go, it means we're going to start moving. So you've got a couple seconds to sniff and then we go. So here's me trying to get my dog to be okay with me carrying him today, but my back is kind of blown right now and his hind leg is not doing so well either. So neither one of us succeeded in this exercise, but you can see how he's predicting that I'm going to carry him. You see him lift some of his paws. So that's where he walks away. He puts pressure away from me. So I let go of him and I ask him again. Notice how he's picking his legs, but I'm not able to lift him up because my back is hurting right now. So I give up on the idea. I'm not going to do it just for the video. But this is a very simple example of how you can prepare your dog for something if you've just taken the time to create a sort of a routine. Like I say this, then I stand this way, then we do this, and that's the end of it. And also like an end cue. So in this particular sequence, I do have a land as a cue for me putting him down once I've carried him. So he knows it actually ends at a certain point. But yeah, that's something that could be helpful to add into your repertoire of training. And I'd be interested in seeing if any of you have done something similar like that with your dogs. Finished. So reward placement is another thing that I really like to talk about, because I don't think we realize that where we put our reward or the treat really does matter, and it can influence where the dog is going to move next based on where the treat comes. So it's important to remember the dog will gravitate towards where the reinforcement last came from. So if it came from the side of your body when you're going on a walk, then that's where your dog is going to hang out, provided it stays consistently in that position. So for behaviors that require us to move away from the dog, for instance, I prefer to make sure that I reward the dog on the ground. Like, so I would place the food next to the dog on the ground, step away, mark, come back, and feed on the ground. So what that does is the dog understands that the reinforcement is with me right here where I am, and rather than with that person, because I'm not hand feeding or I'm not bending over to reward him, but I'm actually placing the cookie, stepping away, like coming back, placing the cookie near the dog. That can make a huge difference with things like a downstay or a mat work, as well as when you're trying to teach them to stay and you're moving away from them. These are things that matter, because if you're hand feeding the dog and going away, then you're telling the dog the reinforcement is going further away from them. And that's what usually tempts them to get up and move with you. So small things like that, just adjusting where the reinforcement is coming from, can really gravitate the dog towards that particular position. In this particular video, it's not the best example, but at least it tells you that where I position the treat when I'm rewarding the dog really helps with where he's staying in position. So note how my hands are next to my thigh when I'm rewarding him. And then when he's in a down, I don't reward there anymore. I reward on the ground, because I want him to stay in that position. I don't want him to jump up to me to take the treat, which is why I reinforce on the ground in this particular situation. So let's look at that again a little bit. Right. So right here, I think I'm gonna let the video do the talking for a bit. Oops. Sometimes thinking time I would think it's not always active. So I was trying to get a video of, trying to get my dog to show whether or not he wants to actively participate in being pet. But my dog is not a big fan of physical affection. So it's not a surprise that this is how he was responding. But what's important to understand is when you're interacting with your dogs and when you're giving affection to them, it's really important to pause every couple of seconds and reconsider whether your dog is actively participating. So that's what the gist of this particular video is. Do you stop every 3 seconds and go, do you want to play? And does your dog still go like, yes, come on, let's continue petting me? That's what you want to see. And you also want yourself to be able to give them the break of being like, no, I don't want to, I want to leave. Because then that way, you coming towards them for pets is not a negative association, because it does, if we are consistently pushing our dogs' boundaries like that, we coming towards them is an indication of something not so great happening to them in that moment. And then it becomes an unpleasant interaction instead of a pleasant one. Even though it does not look very unpleasant on the outside, it's important to really consider what the other animal is thinking in that particular situation. And remember one thing, that consent isn't about absolute permission. So consent can be used in different forms, like even when it comes to cooperative care, or even something as simple as wearing a harness. So I bring out my dog's harness like that in front of him, and he brings his neck forward, and that's when I clip it on. It isn't about asking permission. Can I do this? Can I not? But it's some form of participation that you're asking, and you're checking whether the dog had that participation, whether you need to work a little bit on creating positive associations. It's giving them the ability to opt in and out, and also the ability to understand that I can step away from this if I don't want to. And I think the power of choice and consent is really underestimated. And if you're really interested in learning more about it, I'm sure that myself as well as Miranda would be happy to provide more content on this so that we can sort of guide you towards understanding consent better. But it is really something worth using as part of your everyday life with your dog. So we're at the end of this, and all I want to say is when dogs aren't cooperating with us, we need to start asking better questions. So instead of asking, why won't he listen to me, or why is he so stubborn or she's so stubborn, it's important to ask, is this really necessary? Do I really need my dog to do this? What has their day been like other than this moment? Are their needs met? Are my needs met? And it's important to remember that my dog is a living, breathing being, just like I am. And not every human expectation is realistic for us to have when it comes to a dog's perspective, right? So that's all I have to say for today. And before we head into questions, I just want to talk a little bit about myself. I am a multi-certified dog trainer, like I said before, and I continue my education through Tromplo, Clicker Expo, and other industry professionals, because education is really important in order to keep up with behavior modification protocols. I currently work in Vancouver in person with clients, but also virtually worldwide. And if you would like to learn more from me, I am always available. You can reach out to me on Instagram or by email. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Oh my goodness, that was such a ton of information, and also multiple comments, including from me, on what lovely visuals there are in here. Definitely improving the webinar game for some of us who are maybe not as artistically as inclined.
Yes, this is something I enjoy doing.
Yeah, that was awesome. Okay, so we have some questions for you. The first question we had was earlier in the presentation. So are location-specific markers used instead of a clicker or in addition?
They can be used in addition to a clicker, I would say, because a clicker is just a different marker. So a clicker is an actual object making the sound, whereas a location-specific marker is you creating. But I think I think you could use it as a location marker as well. I just think the purpose of using it is to communicate different sounds mean different things. So I would say it's additionally rather than in place of.
Someone else said that working on cleaning up their cues and mechanics with their deaf dog was been really helpful, including taking videos of their training sessions. So they really appreciated the videos you had. Okay, so you covered a lot of information. I'm not sure how many questions we're going to get based on how much you covered today. But my question for you is, what are like your top 3 things that if you have folks who are, watching this webinar and, oh my gosh, that was so much information, I don't know what to do with it. What are your top 3 things you'd like people to take away from it?
Top 3 things I would say is to understand that your dogs are behaving based on what their needs are in those moments, and not so much based on what we want in that moment. And doing your best to think about how you've practiced in different scenarios, rather than just this one time that you taught this skill, before you expect your dog to understand what to do in a given scenario. And asking what is the need behind the behavior, and not so much just, worried about why the behavior won't happen.
Absolutely. What a great set of takeaways. I like throwing people under the bus with that one and seeing what they come up with. So those were great responses. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And Namita, thank you so much. That was a ton of great information. And like you said, lots of good visuals in here. I was throwing a bunch of them up on Instagram. They're all such great representations of some of the concepts that we talk about a lot. So thank you so much from this. And I'm sure we will hear from you soon.
Thanks, everyone. It was really nice talking to you all.
Yeah. Enjoy your evening. Bye.
Bye.